Good evening.
How are you guys?
Hello, hello. We're just starting a little bit early just to make sure because we're still YouTubers.
Oh, look at you. I'm going to be speechless for the next couple minutes because Polly is reinventing language as we sit here. So you do language, I will do amazement.
Perfect. Uh-oh.
Uh-oh.
Now I feel trapped.
Interestingly enough, that'll actually connect to some of what we're going to talk about tonight, because we're going to talk about communication and communication from God to us and how that all goes wrong. But I'm seeing Polly do things.
Yeah, I'm just typing in the comment. We used to do, let us know where you're from. I'm going to ask.
Yeah.
Let us know where.
Good. So we began, not only did we begin last week on YouTube for the first time, and, we're looking for the best way, always the best way to get this to people and to make it available to people. One of the things we always found out is that when people didn't have Facebook accounts, and there's so many different reasons why, and increasing reasons why in the days that we're living in, that, we're looking for ways to just make our material available to everybody.
Right.
And so if we start doing smoke signals someday, just, keep watching the sky. But for now, it's YouTube.
Yes.
And of course, Think Differently Academy, where we, everything eventually lands there. But for now, kind of our launching pad is YouTube. The landing pad is tdacad.com.
Yes.
Again, if you're new to us, we're Polly and Bob Hamp. We own Think Differently Counseling and Consulting in Grapevine, Texas. We also are the founders of Think Differently Academy, an online academy where all of our teaching about relationship, about spirituality, about freedom, healing, and growth, those are all the different topics that we try to cover on Think Differently Academy. And so if you're new to us, that's a quick introduction to who we are. This, not only is it our second night on YouTube, but our second night of this series called Pathway to Freedom?
A Pathway to Freedom.
Pathway to Freedom.
And just real quick, on our academy, Bob has 3 books in the Think Differently series. And then I have one book called Cherish, and you can get those on the academy site. But you can also, one of the other resources we have is called Hotbox. It's Healing on Purpose. And I'll also put that in the comments too. It's starthotbox.com. And it's a box for both trauma and or trauma. There's 2 different boxes, one specifically targeted just for encompassing trauma, and then one that's if you've had any kind of sexual assault or any healing that you need from that kind of, like, just what's a better way to say that?
So Polly started the Hot Box because there are so many people who may not ever darken the door of a counseling office.
Right.
And it's kind of a beginner's guide and introductory experiences to begin healing. The first one she mentioned from anxiety or depression, trauma. The second one, if you've experienced sexual assault in some way, it's kind of the beginning of understanding that and understanding the healing process.
Yeah. So I'll put that in the comments and the website.
All right. So last week we began by talking about just a simple idea that there are so many ways to misunderstand and so many things that we've been taught and tried to live out when it comes to experiencing our walk with God, his purpose for our lives, his purpose and plan for our lives. And then really, if you kind of dig down deep at all, you become aware that Jesus promised something to the human race that we call freedom. His message really wasn't about correcting behavior. It wasn't about implementing morality. And fundamentally, though it may have been carried by the method of love, his message wasn't even specifically that of love. It was that of freedom, driven by love. Freedom. And I remember very distinctly standing actually in front of a group in Kentucky. And I know the pastor watches our stuff, and so I'm sure he'll remember this moment. Standing in front of a group in Kentucky, and some sweet saint in the back row just spoke up, and my very first sentence, she said, "Just what are we supposed to be getting free from?" And by the end of the next day, she had found great freedom from some things she probably had never admitted to anybody, and just some things that had happened to her as a young girl on the farm. and just began a healing process. I have no idea what became of that, but I just know that she went from questioning what is this freedom thing to engaging some places in her heart that she hadn't necessarily thought would ever get engaged, I think.
It's good.
So that's really, when we talk about this pathway to freedom, we're really talking about, we believe that Jesus, whose advent we just celebrated a month ago, his coming to earth as a man, didn't come just to give information or message or directions. He came to make a meaningful difference in what's possible for the human soul. And there's part of what you heard from us last week is there's so many ways that people go, I'm just going to say, astray in their thinking and understanding and response to, and the prescriptions people make in response to what Jesus came to do, that we end up with denominations upon denominations, messages upon messages, hoops to jump through upon hoops to jump through, where suddenly what we found is, instead of receiving a gift from the one who wants to give healing to us, people pass on the message that there's something we must do for him. Have to live a certain way, have to perform a certain way, certain rules that we're supposed to follow, et cetera, et cetera. I want to address for a minute kind of this idea, because not only across Christianity is there some incredibly diverse opinions, beliefs, and prescriptions for how to respond to the coming and life, ministry, and death of Jesus. But across the globe, there's a variety of responses to what we would consider the one who spoke it all into existence. And so what happens is, we as humans are trying to figure out spiritual things. We're trying to figure out the heavens. We're trying to figure out the ethereal elements of life, and what does the great creator have to do with us, and how do we reach him? And that's kind of what happens then, is the multiple ways that the human minds work comes up with multiple ways to answer the question, what does God want from us?
Yes.
And so I would submit to you that for us moving forward, a super helpful shift for us is not to think, ooh, which one of us has it right? Because I don't think that's a helpful question. But I think a really helpful shift is to think, instead of figuring out which people have it right, let's think for a moment from the perspective of an all-powerful creator who's created a race of people, not a denomination, not a church, but rather a race of, not just a race, what am I looking for? The human race.
The human race.
So I'm not talking about an ethnic race, I'm talking about the human race.
Yeah.
Specifically, he created a race of human beings, and with the intent of carrying out this massive sweeping plan, which we'll talk about in another one of these sessions, when we talk about, so what was his plan? Often, again, I think that's misunderstood, because we think from earth up instead of from heaven down. We think his plan is about us getting it right instead of what he's up to. And so the shift I'm after is, instead of figuring out which human has it right, does Bob have it right? Does Paul have it right? Does Apollos have it right? The Baptists, the Methodists, add to that then the other religions. Who's got it right? Think then instead what it might be like to be a spiritual being with all power and all knowledge, who deeply loves his creation and literally spoke us into existence for the purpose of expressing his love to us, knowing that part of expressing his love to us necessitated that we have the freedom to choose him or not choose him. And in making that setting up that reality, he puts the human race in a garden where we literally choose a completely different way of operating the mind that he gave us. We literally choose a way of operating our mind. Again, this is one we'll cover in great detail in a future session in this series. But we literally choose to live, instead of living from his breath to us, his breath in us, and his breath through us, we choose to live by what we can figure out through our five senses, our knowledge, and our willpower. And so what that means is we've reduced the potential from seeing this massive spiritual reality down to what we can figure out. And what we can figure out based specifically on our five senses. And so if we think of it not as how do we figure out what God wants of us, but what might an all-powerful creator have in mind, I would submit to you that what he has in mind is an offer of connection. And his offer of connection comes very specifically from him to us. And yet the knowledge of good and evil mind, the mind that's decided to live by its five senses and by its intellect, the knowledge of good and evil mind, takes those invitations to connection and says, oh, here's what we have to do. I've counseled enough married couples that I've actually seen that happen in a marriage where one partner reaches out and says, hey, I'm inviting you to connection. The other one says, oh, I knew you wanted me to do that. And in reality, what's happening is there's an invitation to connection, and the other partner hears it as a demand. Now, I can explain all that if that were tonight's topic or another night's topic. That one's actually going to be in a whole nother conversation altogether, right? But it's the same thing when we misinterpret the invitation of a creative, almighty, all-loving God, when we interpret his invitation as a demand or a command. We interpret his invitation to connection as, here are the steps you must do to be acceptable in my sight, loved by me, or for that connection to happen, here's how you have to do it. I've heard one person say it this way, that a lot of people really struggle with this idea that Jesus is the only way, as if somehow that's this exclusive, God is saying no other way except this one way. And I heard one person say, that's almost as if you're drowning in the ocean and someone throws you a life jacket and you go, is that the only life jacket you've got? It's like, if we see it from the perspective of, I want to figure it out, how to get back to the boat, I'm going to be thinking to myself, well, surely there's other options besides that life jacket. And who's that person have the right to demand that I use that life jacket? But if the invitation comes from God, then God is the inviter, and therefore he's the only way. Here's the dilemma, though, I think. I don't know who all we're talking to out there, but if you have grown up in any kind of religious tradition at all, then it's very easy for us, for our perceptions to be colored by those traditions. And what I mean by that is, we've got this picture of, if nothing else, we've got a picture of a God who speaks with old pronouns, right? Thou mustest, returnest unto me by only thine specific efforts. And that little doorway that comes from a belief system built on the knowledge of good and evil, passing through the 1500s in a particular translation of the Bible, we reduce this God who's reaching down to us to our understanding of some language sets, and then our interpretation of those language sets, as if those language sets are demands, expectations, hoops to jump through, et cetera, et cetera. What if it's so much simpler than that? I mean, think about it if you're a parent. Think about when you invite your child to connect, and think about when my kids were little, and the invitation to connection was interpreted so many different ways, whether it was interpreted as a demand or whether it was interpreted as an invitation to something other than what I was inviting.
Today, I went to a service of a friend of mine's husband's life. He passed away recently, and all the kids got, 5 of the kids got up to tell some stories about Dad and all that. And they had told the story about Dad's donut hat. On Saturday mornings, he had, every once in a while, all the kids knew, he'd put on his donut hat, and that morning he was going to go get donuts. And so this invitation of not a word was spoken. And it was just this hat that he had to invite, like, all the kids would like scream and squeal and like be at the window, their room, the girls were talking, and like he would adjust his hat, and they were all so excited because it was an invitation, a beautiful invitation of connection.
Yeah.
And, so Dad goes, gets donuts, comes back, and all the kids pile in and have this beautiful family time of connection. And while you were sharing that story, just the invitation, it's just just thinking of that story is just an incredible, like, reminder here on earth that we can do that as humans, and then God, who loves us dearly, invites, like, with this gift, this beautiful gift of connection, the Spirit for us.
Yeah. It's such a simple and beautiful invitation. I was actually talking to somebody today about when they first came to know the Lord, and how, they thought of themselves as so much less mature when they look back at it, but they realize now how much religion taught them out of the simplicity of that experience and into a series of expectations of performance.
Yeah.
And then along with that expectation of performance came all the guilt, shame, sense of failure, sense of being immature, with the recognition that their maturity really was, at that point, all they had was a simple connection. And yet that's really the invitation, is a simple connection.
Yes.
So what I want to talk about then tonight is the Bible and why the Bible. Rose, I saw your comment. When people read without relationship, they assign a tone to God that's not even there. And that's actually a part of where I want us to go tonight, is this idea. Last week, we talked about 3 levels of reading the Bible. Tonight, I want to talk about literally how to approach it. I'm on Twitter, at Bob Hamp, by the way, in case you haven't followed me yet.
Or Pauline, N as in Nancy, A-Y.
At Pauline, at Bob Hamp.
Yeah.
And I see so many religious debates on Twitter, and most of the time I just kind of stay out. But partly because I don't think a lot of minds will be changed on Twitter.
Until he goes, babe, I'm jumping in. I'm gonna jump in. I'm like, okay, good luck.
Almost always, I jump in for one of 2 reasons. I jump in because somebody's being hurt. I see somebody being critical or harsh or using the Bible in a way to hurt somebody. And I don't think I'm going to change the mind of the person doing that, but I think I might help the person who's being injured by it. Yeah. Secondly, when I see someone who's asking questions and genuinely seems to be asking questions, if I feel like I have anything of value to contribute to that, I'll jump into that. But for the most part, I watch these phrases and they're so ugly. I've tweeted twice in my remembrance.
Are you still in Old Testament?
Not
Old Testament. The King James.
The King James. Yeseth, I ameth. I've tweeted twice. I hate cruelty, especially when it's disguised as theology. Some of the most cruel things that people can do and say are often done in the name of, quote unquote, getting it right for God. And in the process of that, people can just be shredded. So what I want to talk about tonight is literally how to think about approaching the Bible, because what I said last week, I very much believe in the inspiration and the inerrancy of Scripture. I believe that God breathed it into existence, and I believe that it's without mistake. However, listen carefully to what I talk about in the next 5 minutes so you understand what I mean by inerrant and why I think that's an important thing, but more importantly, how to approach that. So let me give you a metaphor. I thought about like dragging all this stuff, but I'm just going to describe it to you. You might see on the wall behind us a couple of guitars hanging there. Let me just turn this for a second. What you can't see is just below those guitars is an amplifier. And if I still had it, that amplifier, when you buy most amplifiers today, they come with all the paperwork, warranty and stuff like that. And they come with something that's called a schematic diagram. If you're an electrician, you can read that schematic diagram, and it's a 100% accurate description of the amplifier. It is without error, and it is completely accurate. However, it does not make music. And so when I talk about approaching the Bible, one of the things I think it's important to understand is the Bible is one of God's means of communicating to us. And yet, if we think of it as the only means, we're actually going to find ourselves in a one-dimensional conversation with someone who wants to have a multi-dimensional conversation. And I'm going to submit to you that if we really read the Bible, Old Testament through New Testament, and look at how God communicated with people, he talked to them. That, I guarantee, will be another session for us during this series, is about God speaking to humans. I'm not even going to go into like defending that tonight, because I don't have any defense to offer except to say my clear understanding of Scripture, not only how it teaches, but how it demonstrates both Old and New Testament that God communicates to the human race directly. Again, we'll talk about that in another session. Then what that tells me is that his primary means of communication is to speak to us. The Bible is an important one, but it's not primary. Anybody freaking out yet? Listen, again, I want to say I believe in the inspiration and the inerrancy and infallibility of Scripture, but let's go back to my illustration. So you buy a brand new amplifier, and if you understand that kind of stuff, you can open up that what I call schematic diagram, and you can actually see a perfect representation of the functionality. In other words, the electronic schematics, the circuit board, and everything that fits together. See how much I don't know about it? I've used all the fancy words I know, but it's literally an accurate picture of the electronic aspect of the amplifier. But two things about it, maybe three things. Number one, it doesn't look like the amplifier at all. It's a one-dimensional piece of paper with a diagram on it that's descriptive of a reality that exists off that page. Let me finish the whole thing, and then we'll go back and go through the whole Bible with this or go through about the Bible with this in mind. Secondly, not only does it not look like the amplifier, it doesn't function like the amplifier. The amplifier, as amazing as it is, and it's a cool amp. I'm sorry you can't see it. I'm not even going to talk more about it. But as amazing as that amplifier is, it exists not because the amplifier itself is important, but it exists because it allows somebody to make music. The purpose of it is to produce music. So we go back to the schematic diagram. We're actually 2 degrees away from the intended purpose, right? The purpose is to allow somebody to make music. The reality is a 3-dimensional amplifier. The 100% accurate, infallible, and inerrant diagram accurately describes the reality, but it doesn't point towards the function, or it doesn't create music in any way. The creation of music comes from the person and their own musicianship in the amplifier. Now let's pick this apart. The Bible is an important document. It accurately describes, listen carefully to what I'm about to say, it accurately describes the history of God's relationship to the human race, past, present, and future. How does it do that? Well, it does that through stories and poetry and history and all these different things, where what you see is all the different authors of the Bible books have taken their experience and put it into writing, so that we can see from multiple different people's perspectives, multiple different writing styles perspectives, and multiple different experiential perspectives, how God related to people in several specific situations. But the difficulty is, it doesn't necessarily say how he related to you today in the middle of your situation. It doesn't. I mean, it gives principles, it shows some ways that it's happened before, but your situation is unique and it's not like anybody else's. And so what we have to be able to do is read that book not as if it's got prescriptive answers for every single human circumstance, but rather as it's an accurate diagram that describes a reality that exists for a specific purpose. Accurate diagram describing a reality that exists for a purpose even greater than the reality itself. So the Bible describes, it's the diagram that describes the reality of the history, present, and future of God's relationship to the human race as a whole. Is that pretty full? Is that covered? Yeah. And so when we read it and we try to pull from that, this is the exact prescription for Susie's circumstance in 2021. The dilemma is, I don't think we can very often do that. I think there's some things like thou shalt nots where we can say, for the most part, you know what, you shouldn't do that. But let me just say why I say, for the most part, we can say you shouldn't do that, right? Before I scare people even further. One of the easiest commandments for us all to kind of think about is one where it says, thou shalt not kill. Exodus 25, whatever it is, thou shalt not kill. Sounds pretty black and white. I'm a fan of that one. I think thou shouldn't. I think Weist shouldn't, as a whole, weist shouldn't kill. But the same God who said that and chiseled that on stone also told David to go kill some people. Is God schizophrenic? Or do we misunderstand the scriptures when we read it as prescriptive and specific to every single situation? Here's another one. God says throughout the Old Testament, don't eat unclean animals. And then in Acts, Peter's goes into a trance on the rooftop, and in that trance, God shows him a vision of lowering a sheet full of unclean animals and says, Peter, take and eat. And Peter looks and goes, Lord, those things are unclean. And God says, if I told you to eat it, I meant eat it. That's not really how he says it. He says, if I have declared it clean, then it's not unclean. But the point is, it would appear that God violates his own decrees at some time. And so if what we think is it's a rule book to tell all of us how to perform, then God could be schizophrenic and inconsistent. But if it's a story, it's a history, present, and future of the story of God's relationship to the human race, sometimes specifically and sometimes generally, what you see is that God's got a lot more breathing room than just the thou shalt nots. Now, if you hear me and go, oh, perfect, then let's go do all the thou shalt nots because Bob just said, then you haven't heard me at all. That's the very issue that Paul addressed in Romans 6 when he said, if you hear grace as an opportunity to sin, then you've really missed the message. The whole point is grace provides when sin happens. That's another conversation altogether, but so many things to say. Anyway, here's what we're after. The Bible is an accurate description of God's relationship to the human race, sometimes specific, sometimes general, past, present, and future. There are times it's more prescriptive than other times. Most of the time it's descriptive of specific circumstances. And so what you have is a description of a reality. So the reality is this. The reality is God relates to the human race. Part of why I said a minute ago, I believe God's
Today.
Yeah.
Yes. Still.
Past, present, future.
Yes.
Past, present, future. Past, present, future. And one of the reasons I say that God speaks to us is because if you look at the reality described in the diagram, or the reality that's described there, you see that God's consistent way of relating, like that, God's consistent way of relating to the human race is he speaks to them. And he expects them to hear and speak back to him.
Well, and how many stories have we heard from missionaries from all over the world? People who work with different groups of people, never read the Bible, never seen a Bible, and they have visions of God, and God shows up to them and speaks to them without the scriptures.
Yeah.
And it's, the stories are amazing and just stunning because God still speaks today.
And tomorrow.
And tomorrow.
So the diagram, the Bible, the scriptures, describes for us a reality. The reality is God's relationship from God down to the human race. How do I relate to the human race? And the third thing, the amplifier, that reality exists not just to be a good amplifier. It exists to allow music to be made. And music is made when a human being comes to a relationship with not only notes and rhythms, but to understand that there's something to be heard that can be reproduced through, again, I'm a guitar player, so I'd say it this way, that can be reproduced through my fingers on the neck of the guitar, but I first hear, that's another lesson in this series. When we talk Absolutely. About the receive, contain, broadcast versus hear or consider, decide, initiate as a way of living. We'll talk about improvisational thinking, but that's another lesson. But the point is that the amplifier exists in order that music be made. And music comes from, music is this beautiful integration of idea, reality, person, concept, et cetera, where out of them comes something that's bigger than just them. So, diagram, amplifier, the ability to make music. Scripture, relationship, God's relationship to the human race. The ability for us to broadcast into creation the presence of the one who we came from and return to. And that is not that we broadcast the words of the diagram so that everybody can get the diagram right, but so that we can bring the person of God with us, and into any given moment breathe the things that are true about him. So this is a conversation that's gotten a little out of hand in social media these days, because it's gotten out of hand in reality. And that is this idea that dominion, the theology of taking dominion over the creation, has gotten out of hand. And what I would say is not that it's gotten out of hand, but it's taken a serious, I was going to say left turn, but I don't mean left or right. I just mean a serious wrong turn. And what I mean by that is I still believe that God created the human race to partner with him and take dominion over the creation. But the definition of what that means has nothing to do with political, military, or even ideological aspirations. It has to do with this. If what I inhale, I contain, and what I contain, I exhale, then I inhale love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, meekness, mercy, and self-control. And what that means is, for me to take dominion over the creation, it means that in any moment, any place, any geography that I inhabit, I bring with me those things: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, etc., and have the capacity to breathe those things into the atmosphere around me. I don't mean, what I mean is I can speak, carry with me peace, and bring peace to a place where there's chaos. Mm-hmm. I can bring with me love and bring love with me to a place where there's been hate, and so on and so on. I have the ability, as do you, as does Polly, that when God created us with that assignment, it wasn't about military or political dominion. It's literally about bringing the person, the character, the nature of God with us everywhere we go. That's what Adam and Eve did. Genesis 2 through Genesis 3 point halfway. They literally carried the person of God with them, or the breath of God in them, I should say, so that everywhere they went, they breathed his nature, until they didn't. And they didn't simply because, not because this is for another conversation, maybe even next week, not because they were bad and got punished, but because they disconnected from the breath of God, and they connected to something called the knowledge of good and evil, or their ability to see based on their five senses and reason what's right and what's wrong. No longer did they live from receive, contain, broadcast. They lived from, what do I see, think, and hear? What's right and what's wrong? I'm going to try to live based on that. And that's the thing that got everything upended.
And it was all through the lens of shame.
All through the lens of shame that came on them at that point. And they began to paint the world with this inverted picture of how do we all get back to God, instead of the idea that what if God's issuing an invitation to connection? Mm. If we could understand again how simple all that is.
And sweet and beautiful and powerful.
And that the Bible provides us not a series of rules, commandments, steps to follow, but rather a description, an accurate description of a relationship. And that relationship exists so that we can metaphorically make music. Yeah. We'll talk about much more about how this unfolds, some practicalities of this. But again, so many of the practicalities have to do with ways of thinking, because what you just heard us say is that the way of thinking in the garden was completely inverted. Hence, by the way, why we call ourselves Think Differently.
Yes.
Right? So those are the directions we're headed. I think last week and this week we've covered a lot about the scriptures. My goal next week is that we talk specifically about the message of Jesus a bit more. So I think there's so many ways that we've gotten that distorted. So
if you want to, we're making a playlist of this whole series. So I think you can subscribe to this playlist. If you can subscribe to Think Differently, I'm not to the place of being subscribe here, push this button. We're not there yet.
We'll work on it.
We'll work on that.
Know you want us to.
Exactly. And then and then you can have the whole playlist also, so you can just come back and rewatch or things like that. So one of the things we've learned is that the questions don't stay on the same way they do on Facebook for us to be able to go back through and see them. So for those of y'all who are watching this past January 23rd or 24th, for those who are watching now, there is we have our, oh my gosh, Reclaim conference. You're looking at me like, what are you talking about?
I was trying to figure out where you were going.
We have a Reclaim conference that's coming up starting this Friday evening. It's last year we did it in person. This year we're doing it virtual, obviously, for all the reasons. And
taking back the life that abuse tried to steal from you.
Exactly.
There's a few more days left to register. It starts Friday night. And so if you have been or are in an abusive relationship and are trying to figure out how to get your life back, that's what this conference is for.
And the great thing about this conference is included in your price is you get to keep it for the whole year.
Yeah.
And so you can watch it if you can't make it live or while we do the conference live, then you get to have it for a whole year, and you can watch it whenever you want in your jammies, which is so great.
It's amazing.
And so let's see here. We're going to take a few minutes and answer some of the questions for our live audience. And let's see here. Hello. And I saw somebody said hi from Tennessee. Hi, Julie. And then thank you, Stanley, for that feedback on liking this new format. We're really excited about it. And Shona, yeah, we're looking forward to seeing you this weekend on our event. And you're in Ireland, so I guess you're still there, unless you're in the States for a reason. Rose, and then Bethany, thank you. That donut hat story is just such a sweet story. And
not one extra.
Don't get it. I saw that. I'm not sure who that is. I can't tell for Pro Stripe. I saw you type that before he explained a little bit more. So how is that? Was the explanation? Is there any other question you have about don't get it? And then
let me just say,
yeah,
it's also the reason this is a series and not just a single video is because it's a significant mind shift that sometimes the individual pieces are harder to really grasp until you've kind of gone through the whole picture. And so I would say, if you don't get it, stay with us and come back.
Yeah.
We want changing the way you think is very different than changing what you think. And confusion is often the first experience you have when your mind starts to shift the way you think. And so I hear you don't get it. We don't mean to be confusing. That's not it at all. But confusion is often the result of the first step of thinking differently.
Yeah. And so just a question that kind of pops into my head that I've heard before is, so do you just throw out all the scriptures?
Absolutely not. I think that the scriptures are incredibly important and incredibly valuable to us. What I am saying is that they need to inhabit the right place. I believe they come directly from God. I think that one of the things that happens is we interpret it wrong for at least two reasons. Number one, we come to it from the perspective of it is a black and white book that gives us rules for living, as opposed to it's a description of the history of the present and future relationship. And secondly, we come at it assuming that the words on the page, it's going to sound funny if this is new to you, we come at it assuming that the words on the page are always accurate. And what I mean by that is the Bible was actually written originally, the Old Testament in Hebrew and the New Testament in Greek. And it's been translated multiple times over the years. And it's simply impossible for interpreters, translators, to not insert their own thoughts, because that's what translators do. And so translators don't just translate word for word. If you've ever if you're bilingual, or if you've ever spoken in a country where you have to operate with a translator, you start to realize the complexity of even live translation. And so when you try to translate spiritual ideas and you try to translate them over changes in culture and over time to try to get through to people, when the knowledge of good and evil is already a filter, you can see that sometimes the language, let me just give a quick example of that we discovered in Taiwan.
Yeah.
So Polly was speaking on the masculine and the feminine, and we were digging in a little bit right before she went up to speak into Genesis 2, where it says that the woman was created as a helper suitable to the man's needs. And so for years, I said, she's a helper suitable to my needs. And and here's the thing. In Hebrew, the word "to his needs" is not in there. The word "needs" isn't in the original Hebrew. But somebody who translated into the current system of English that we're dealing with thought, well, that must mean suitable to his needs. So let's just insert the word "needs." One of the things you'll find is most translations, if there's a word in italics in that translation, that means that word was inserted by the translator to make it make more sense. But sometimes it actually makes it wrong.
Yes.
And
harmful.
So the deal is that phrase right there, helper suitable to his needs, suddenly makes it sound like she's here to do my laundry and my dishes or whatever else I proclaim my needs to be. The reality is, if you take the word "needs" out of there, it goes much deeper, and it says that she's a helper suitable to my being, not to my needs, but to me. Think about it for a second. Male and female used to be one, and God separated the two of them. How could they not be important to each other's well-being? But when it says the woman is a helper suitable to the needs, it sets up this terrible mindset that says, oh, women should serve the needs of men.
And whole cultures and religions put that in there, and women are subject to.
Yeah. Those kind of things are rife through the scriptures. And I'm not saying everybody has to be a Hebrew scholar or a Greek scholar. But what I'm saying is, when you read the words, you want to start with the idea that a loving God is trying to extend an invitation to connection. And if what you're reading doesn't sound that way, get a Strong's Concordance. Get an iPhone. And on there, you can just look up that, look for an interlinear Bible. We did this on our How to Read the Bible series back on Think Differently Academy. But look at an interlinear Bible, and it will give you translations of the words and the phrases. And if you see the words in italics, you can read that phrase again and go, what could it mean if that word wasn't really there? Assume from God down, not from human beings up, that a loving creator is reaching for connection with us. And read with that in mind, and then figure out, okay, if this doesn't feel like that, let's look again through some different lenses. Yeah. John 1, one of my favorite, actually did a translation of that through my own thought process of what does the invitation sound like from John 1. In the beginning, God was the Word was God, and the Word and anyway, I'm not saying it well right now, but
so Beth, yay, you can finally chat. You got it figured out.
Nice.
Sweet. And we'll look forward to seeing you this weekend too. And there's nothing wrong with the wife working in the home and the hubby working in the yard or on the car. Just want to make absolutely.
We're in no way commenting on whether or not it's okay to take care of each other.
And it's okay for men
to serve each other,
to work, stay at home, and for women to work.
You see how quick that goes from thought process to prescription.
Yeah.
We're simply saying that word doesn't exist in that passage in the Bible.
It's about connection and communication and mutuality, and how do we structure our relationship in respect and honor with each other the way God intended it for two to become one.
Yeah. So.
And then, awesome. Okay. Well, you guys have a great night. And thank you so much for your wonderful comments. And we're excited to be on this platform again. And we will keep reminding probably all the way through January, just through a video, but then we'll pop some just links each time. Make sure to subscribe to our channel, please.
Yes.
That will be helpful. And then you'll get reminders. And then also you can subscribe to, I think I made this a playlist. I know I made it a playlist. I think you can subscribe to it. So
awesome.
Awesome. Y'all have a fantastic evening, and go check out, if you're before the 24th, go check out tdacad.com to check out Reclaim, our conference. It's both for men and women this time. Last year it was only for women. So the guys are invited also to this. And we can't wait to see you.
See
Good
you
night.
guys.
Bye-bye.